Chapter 17. Winnie the Pooh hung from the ceiling next to Spider-Man. Bill Clinton dangled nearby with his papier-mâché grin, fat and patient, waiting to get beaten open at some kid's birthday party. Romeo Gilberto Osorio barely noticed them anymore. When you spend enough years making piñatas, presidents and cartoon bears start to look about the same. He was at his work table, twisting wire into the skeleton of the next one. If you'd wandered in off the street, you'd have thought, retired art teacher, community center guy, someone who remembered everyone's kids' names. You would not have thought, former guerrilla commander, a man who spent 12 years living underground in a country eating itself alive. The man Ed Bradley put on national television and implied in front of 60 million Americans had helped murder 4 United States Marines. Osorio set down the wire and looked at the skeleton on the table. Born in San Francisco in 1947, shipped to El Salvador at 6 months when his parents' marriage fell apart, raised in Ilobasco watching ceramicists work clay with their hands. He came back to the United States at 18 and walked straight into the Vietnam-era draft, joined the Air Force before they could call him, learned English during basic training, rose in rank because he was good at figuring things out. Came back to the mission in the early 70s, helped found the Mission Cultural Center for Latin American Arts, wrote some of the first essays in English on contemporary Salvadoran poetry. Built something real, the slow, patient way. Then he went back to El Salvador to open a fine art gallery, and the timing was about as bad as timing gets. The government shut it down within a year. His friends started disappearing, not metaphorically, not drifting away, but the specific kind of disappearing that happened in El Salvador in 1980, when bodies turned up on roadsides with marks on them that told you everything about the last few hours, and nothing you wanted to know. So he joined the FMLN, lived underground for 12 years. Rose to command. When the war ended in 1992, he came home, made art, opened the piñata shop when the previous owner closed it because the shop paid the rent and kept the studio running. The Air Force and the guerrillas and the 12 years underground and the 60 Minutes segment and the federal investigation and the quiet clearance that came too late to undo what the broadcast had already done, all of it lived inside one ordinary-looking man at a work table in the Mission District, while Winnie the Pooh and Spider-Man swayed overhead and the city moved through its afternoon outside the open door. Some stories don't resolve cleanly. They just keep going. The 60 Minutes episode wasn't even about Zona Rosa. What CBS was chasing in May 1995 was a fight over combat awards, specifically whether American military advisors who served in El Salvador deserved the medals that came with having officially been in combat. These were soldiers who had taken fire, returned fire, watched friends get hit, done everything soldiers do in a shooting war, but Washington had called them advisors the entire time, a word chosen to keep the official position clean and the public uninformed. When they came home, that word followed them. No combat awards. No acknowledgement that what they'd been through was real. The Pentagon's paperwork said they'd been training people. The men said they'd been fighting. CBS brought in Osorio, a former FMLN commander, a U.S. citizen living openly in San Francisco, to confirm it from the other side of the gun. And from where he sat, it was simply the truth. The rebels had treated American advisors as military targets. Those men had been in a war. That was the interview he thought he was giving. Then Bradley asked about the FMLN's broader strategy of targeting American servicemen, and Osorio answered honestly, yes, it had been deliberate. It had been policy. The idea was to pressure Congress into cutting support for the Salvadoran military. This wasn't a confession. It was documented strategy, part of the public record of a war that had been over for 3 years. Bradley ran the segment anyway, with narration telling viewers that Osorio had admitted to helping plan the Zona Rosa massacre. Words Osorio had not spoken, had not implied. That had no real relationship to anything he'd said on camera. A week later, he denied it in the San Francisco Examiner. By then, 60 million people had already seen it, and tucked it away in the place where the mind files things it assumes are true. What followed was something the federal government almost never does. It investigated itself. The Senate Intelligence Committee ordered a full review. Inspector General offices at Justice, the CIA, State, and the Pentagon all got pulled in. Thousands of classified documents came out of the archives where they'd been sitting for a decade. Dozens of officials were interviewed under oath. The DOJ prosecutors who had spent years working the Zona Rosa case told the review something that landed hard. They had never heard the name Gilberto Osorio before the broadcast. Not once. A decade of building the case and the name had never crossed their desks. After the segment aired, a DOJ attorney named Dana Beal ran it all the way down and found nothing. No witness, no document, no intercept, no thread of any kind placing Osorio in the planning or execution of June 19, 1985. He'd been FMLN, had risen to command, knew the organization's thinking from the inside. But there was nothing tying him to Zona Rosa. Bradley had implied more than the evidence could support, and the gap between those two things, between what television can suggest and what a courtroom can prove, was the space Osorio had been living in since the cameras went dark. What the review actually turned up had nothing to do with Osorio. The CIA had known for years who probably ran the operation. His name was Pedro Antonio Andrade. The agency's internal assessment naming him as the likely mastermind had been withheld from the DOJ prosecutors building the case, not for days, but for months, while the investigation moved forward without its most important piece of intelligence. When Andrade was finally arrested in El Salvador in 1989, the U.S. Embassy sent a formal request that he not be prosecuted. He was worth more as an active intelligence asset than as a defendant in a murder case. That had been rumored for years, passed around in careful language between people unsure how much they were allowed to say. The review made it something else. Documented, quoted, sitting in the official record with the permanence of things that were never meant to see daylight. In June 1990, about a year after his arrest, Pedro Antonio Andrade boarded a flight to the United States. The man intelligence reports had repeatedly linked to Zona Rosa, the man some investigators believed had helped plan the murder of 4 American Marines, was being allowed to enter the very country those Marines had sworn to defend. No courtroom ruling, no public debate. The decision moved instead through the machinery of government, a State Department parole request to the Immigration and Naturalization Service, arguing that Andrade had provided valuable assistance and that his life was in danger. INS approved it under a provision allowing entry in the public interest. Each agency signed off on its own piece and trusted that someone else was minding the whole. While in Salvadoran custody, Andrade had spent months identifying guerrilla personnel, discussing weapons caches, helping American officials map the insurgency from the inside. According to government records, he was even helping produce a CIA-funded propaganda film denouncing the FMLN. To some officials, he was a rare asset whose information could save lives. Assistant U.S. Attorney John Murtaugh learned about it after the fact. He was shocked. He was furious. He believed significant intelligence pointed to Andrade's involvement in the massacre, even if prosecutors lacked enough admissible evidence to bring charges. But the decision had already been made. Andrade was in America, living among relatives, beyond the reach of the objections that had never been heard. Years later, a Justice Department Inspector General investigation concluded that the parole process had broken down. Officials from multiple agencies had previously agreed that any proposal to bring Andrade to the United States required interagency review. That review never occurred. The request moved through routine channels. DOJ's opposition was never formally presented to the officials who approved it. The Inspector General ultimately concluded that DOJ's objections had been reasonable, that the intelligence linking Andrade to the attack was real. The result was the most extraordinary irony of the entire case. The United States had spent years hunting the men who killed 4 Marines. One of the individuals suspected of helping orchestrate the attack was ultimately granted entry into the United States, not despite his connection to the war, but because of it. Intelligence had outweighed prosecution. And while the families of the dead kept searching for answers, Andrade began a new life in America. Meanwhile, Osorio, cleared of any involvement, had his face shown to 60 million Americans as a probable killer. That raised a question nobody particularly wanted to answer out loud. Had others connected to Zona Rosa been let in? Had the border been open in some fashion to people with blood on their hands from a restaurant terrace in San Salvador? The answer was neither clean nor comforting. Some Salvadorans with ties, direct or indirect, to the guerrilla networks involved had entered the country over the years, coming through a mix of immigration channels, intelligence arrangements, and the ordinary gaps that open up when agencies don't talk to each other and nobody is assigned to mind the space between them. There was no evidence of a deliberate policy. Nobody sat in a room and signed off on that. But there was also nothing that reliably stopped it. No system, no cross-check, no process that functioned across agency lines. It wasn't a conspiracy. It was something more mundane and in some ways more disturbing than a conspiracy. A bureaucracy doing what bureaucracies do, each part optimizing for its own mission, leaving the accounting to someone else, and hoping the pieces added up to something that looked like justice from far enough away. In 1997, 12 years after the attack, the Senate held public hearings. Officials testified. Documents went into the record. For the families of the 4 Marines, it wasn't closure. It was a reminder of everything that hadn't happened. A detailed, documented, carefully qualified account of why the thing that was promised on the tarmac at Andrews Air Force Base had not been delivered. No one was convicted in an American court. Sealed charges stayed sealed. Others were released or lost in the machinery of a foreign legal system, pushed beyond the reach of prosecution by the slow accumulation of war, diplomacy, and time. By the late 1990s, the urgency that had once made every decision feel necessary had long since dissolved. What was left was the record, not one moment where someone chose impunity over accountability, but a long sequence of individual decisions, each defensible on its own terms, each reasonable given the pressures of the moment, that taken together had produced a result nobody would have publicly defended at the start. The system built to find them had been pulled in 2 directions at every critical point and had consistently resolved that tension the same way. It didn't fail completely. It didn't succeed either. It did what institutions do when the crisis fades and the political cost of accountability starts to outweigh the political cost of letting things drift. It found a way to keep moving forward while leaving certain things permanently behind. Chapter 18. The war ended on paper in January 1992, but El Salvador did not become a different country overnight. Peace came the way exhaustion comes, not as a triumph, but as a threshold, the point past which continuing was simply no longer possible. The accords were real. The ceasefire held. The FMLN fighters came down from the mountains and out of the safe houses and laid their weapons in stacks that were photographed and catalogued and handed over to UN observers who had flown in from places that had never known this particular kind of war. It was an extraordinary thing, objectively, a guerrilla movement that had fought the state for 12 years, agreeing to become part of it, to trade the logic of the gun for the slower, more uncertain logic of the ballot box. But the institutions those ballots were meant to animate were not ready for what was being asked of them. The economy was fragile. The judiciary was weak. The security forces that the accords were supposed to transform carried inside them the habits of a system that had spent a decade operating outside the law. Disappearances, death squads, the casual violence of men who had been told, repeatedly and at the highest levels, that certain things were permitted. You could sign those men into a new institutional framework. You could not sign out what they had become. The gap between the country the accords imagined, and the country that actually existed on the first morning of peace was vast, and it did not close quickly. Governing proved harder than opposing. It always does. The FMLN discovered this with the grinding specificity of a party that had built its identity around resistance and now had to build a budget. Corruption moved into the spaces that ideology had occupied. Bureaucracy absorbed momentum. The promises made at Chapultepec, land reform, institutional accountability, the possibility of a security that did not depend on fear, collided with the reality of a state that lacked the capacity, and sometimes the will, to deliver them. Public expectations were high. Results were uneven. The distance between what had been promised and what arrived widened with each election cycle, until, for many Salvadorans, it had stopped feeling like a gap and started feeling like the truth about how things worked. Meanwhile, another story was unfolding. Quieter at first, less visible, but in the long run more consequential than the political drama playing out in San Salvador. Migration had accelerated during the war, people fleeing violence the way water moves away from pressure, toward wherever the opening was. Los Angeles, Washington, Houston, New York, cities that had not asked for an influx of Spanish-speaking refugees from a conflict most Americans could not have located on a map, and that received one anyway, in the tens and then hundreds of thousands, people arriving with almost nothing and building out of necessity, out of stubbornness, out of the particular human insistence on survival, something resembling a life. They worked construction and restaurants and maintenance. They rented rooms in neighborhoods that were not yet neighborhoods, that became neighborhoods because enough of them arrived and stayed. They sent money home. Remittances that became, over time, not a supplement to the Salvadoran economy, but its architecture, the thing holding the whole structure upright. El Salvador was no longer simply a place these people had left. It was something they carried forward, maintained across the distance of a continent, kept alive in the wiring of their phones and the envelopes sent south every month. But stability abroad did not mean security. Many lived without legal status, in crowded housing, navigating systems that offered real opportunity alongside the constant low-grade anxiety of a life that could be dismantled by a single encounter with the wrong official at the wrong moment. The opportunity was genuine. So was the precariousness. And a second generation was coming of age. In Los Angeles, Salvadoran youth entered a city that already had its own geography of violence. Neighborhoods where gang structures had been entrenched for decades, where the available forms of belonging were limited, where schools were under-resourced and families were focused on survival in the most literal sense. Institutional support was scarce. The formal systems that were supposed to catch young people in the gaps, counselors, after-school programs, the ordinary social infrastructure of stability, were not built for this volume, this need, this particular combination of displacement and poverty, and the cultural dislocation of being raised between two worlds without fully belonging to either. For some, belonging was found elsewhere, was found. MS-13 did not emerge from the Salvadoran Civil War. It was formed in the United States, in American cities, shaped by American conditions, the specific pressures of immigrant poverty, the specific violence of neighborhoods where control was already organized along gang lines, the specific logic of a young person who needs protection and finds it in the only place offering any. The connection to El Salvador was not ideological, it was demographic. The same communities, the same diaspora, the same generation, caught between the country their parents had fled and the country that had not quite accepted them. Over time, the organizations became more structured, more disciplined, more capable of violence at a scale that began to attract a different kind of attention. Then the dynamics were sent back. As American deportation policy hardened through the 1990s and into the 2000s, thousands were returned to El Salvador, many of whom had spent most of their lives in the United States, who spoke English more fluently than Spanish, who had no meaningful connection to the country their paperwork said they were from. They arrived in a nation still struggling to rebuild its basic institutions, carrying structures that had developed on foreign soil, in a foreign context, and that now took root in ground that had very little holding it together. El Salvador was not prepared. It did not have the prisons, the social services, the law enforcement capacity, or the political coherence to absorb what was arriving. What followed was not a sudden collapse. It rarely is. It was a gradual expansion, neighborhood by neighborhood, of an influence that the state could not match and increasingly could not contain. Violence took on a different character than the war had produced. Less ideological. No manifestos, no political demands, no vision of a future society against which the present could be measured and found wanting. What replaced all of that was simpler, and in some ways, more suffocating. Control. Street by street, block by block. The invisible internal borders of a country that had traded one form of terror for another. Businesses paid extortion or closed. Families learned which corners were crossable and which were not. Absorbed this knowledge into the body the way people absorb any information essential to daily survival. Automatically, without having to think about it consciously, the way you learn to read the weather. Young men received a recruitment visit and understood that the answer they gave would determine what came next. Women learned routes home that avoided certain stretches of road. Governments responded with force because force was the language available to them. Mass arrests, emergency measures, crackdowns announced with the confident rhetoric of states that have confused activity with progress. Prisons filled. The organizations adapted, found in confinement not dissolution, but a new kind of structure. The cell block as headquarters, the prison yard as command center, the state's own infrastructure turned into the architecture of the thing the state was trying to destroy. Public frustration deepened into something that no longer had patience for the language of improvement. By the late 2010s, the question had shifted. It was no longer whether the post-war system could be made to work better. That question assumed a system capable of working, one that needed adjustment rather than replacement. What the accumulated years had produced instead, the failed promises, the widening impunity, the violence that the state seemed unable to arrest and in some places seemed simply to have accommodated, was a population that had stopped believing in the premise of the question. For many Salvadorans, the post-war order had failed its most basic obligation: not prosperity, not equality, not the distant aspirations of the peace accords, but the simpler and more foundational thing underneath all of those: security. The ordinary expectation that a person could move through their day without calculating the odds of not coming home. When a system is seen as incapable, not merely imperfect, not frustrating, but genuinely, structurally unable to deliver the thing it exists to deliver, the demand stops being for reform. It becomes a demand for something different entirely. What that something would look like and what it would cost was the question El Salvador was about to answer.